Most people notice a waitress only when she makes a mistake. The coffee's too cold, the order's wrong, the smile's not bright enough. They see the uniform, not the woman wearing it. They see the service, not the sacrifice. But on a rain-soaked Tuesday night at Romano's, one waitress did something that shattered every rule about staying invisible. And the man watching from table 12 was exactly the kind of person who noticed everything. Sofia Torino had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight. 5'4" in her sensible shoes, brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun, makeup-free face that customers forgot the moment she walked away. Her black uniform hung loose on her thin frame, hiding the sharp angles that came from choosing between rent money and grocery money too many times. She moved through Romano's dining room like smoke, there and gone, filling water glasses and clearing plates with hands that never shook, even when the customers treated her like furniture. The rain hammered against the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the Seattle street into a blur of neon and headlights. Inside, the warm golden light made everything look expensive, from the hand-painted tiles to the imported Italian marble bar. Sofia had been working here for 8 months, long enough to know which tables tipped well and which customers would send back their food, just to watch her apologize. She was wiping down table 6 when she heard it, the kitchen door swinging open, followed by rapid-fire Italian from the line cooks. Not the broken English-Italian hybrid they usually spoke, but pure, musical Italian that made her grandmother's voice echo in her memory. Madonna mia, che disastro! Giuseppe, the pasta cook, gestured wildly at a dropped tray of gnocchi. Tutto rovinato! Without thinking, Sofia responded in perfect Italian. Non ti preoccupare, Giuseppe, ne faccio un altro piatto in 5 minuti. The kitchen went quiet. Giuseppe stared at her like she'd just spoken in tongues. Sofia felt heat creep up her neck as she realized her mistake. She'd been invisible for so long, she'd forgotten other people could hear her. "You speak Italian?" Giuseppe asked in English, his eyes wide. Sofia shrugged, already retreating back into her shell. "My grandmother taught me." She escaped before he could ask more questions, but she felt the curious stares following her. Being noticed was dangerous. Being noticed meant people asked questions, and questions led to conversations about things Sofia didn't discuss. Like why her grandmother had whispered bedtime stories in Sicilian dialect. Like why she taught a little girl to identify regional accents and speak the language of old-world families who valued tradition above all else. The front door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and something else. Something that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees without anyone touching the thermostat. Sofia looked up from her order pad to see 3 men in expensive suits shaking rain from their coats. The first 2 were clearly muscle. Broad shoulders, watchful eyes, the kind of men who checked corners and kept their hands free. But it was the third man who commanded attention without saying a word. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that belonged on ancient Roman coins. His suit probably cost more than Sofia made in 3 months, charcoal grey and tailored to terrifying perfection. He surveyed the dining room like a general inspecting a battlefield. When his gaze swept across Sofia, she felt it like a physical touch. Dark eyes that missed nothing, calculated everything, and filed away information she didn't know she was giving. Marco Sant'Angelo. She'd heard the name whispered in the kitchen, seen the newspaper photos, knew enough to recognize Seattle's most dangerous businessman when he walked into her workplace. The kind of man who owned politicians and buried problems. The kind of man smart waitresses avoided at all costs. Sofia grabbed a stack of menus and approached their table with practiced invisibility, eyes down, movements efficient. Don't engage, don't make conversation, take the order, bring the food, collect the check, disappear. "Good evening," she said to the table in general, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Can I start you with something to drink?" One of the bodyguards ordered scotch. The other wanted wine. Marco said nothing, just watched her with those calculating dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade. Sophia felt sweat gather between her shoulder blades despite the restaurant's air conditioning. She'd served plenty of dangerous men before. Romano's attracted a certain clientele, the kind who paid cash and expected discretion. But Marco Sant'Angelo radiated a different kind of power. The kind that didn't need to make threats because everyone already knew what he was capable of. She brought their drinks on a silver tray, hands steady despite the voice in her head screaming at her to run. When she set Marco's glass down, his fingers brushed hers for just a moment. The contact was brief, probably accidental, but it sent electricity shooting up her arm. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was exactly what she'd expected. Deep, controlled, with just a hint of an accent that spoke of old-world traditions and dangerous loyalties. Sophia nodded and retreated, but she could feel his eyes following her across the room. She busied herself with other tables, refilling bread baskets and taking orders, but her awareness kept returning to table 12, to the man who sat like a king holding court, speaking in low tones with his associates while his attention tracked her movement through the dining room. She was clearing the appetizer plates from table 9 when she heard it again. Italian, but different this time. Older, more musical, tinged with something that made her grandmother's voice whisper in her memory. Marco was on his phone, speaking in rapid Sicilian dialect to someone who was clearly giving him trouble. The words flowed like honey and vinegar, sweet sounds wrapped around razor-sharp irritation. Sophia froze, her hands full of dirty plates. She understood every word. Not just the Italian that Giuseppe spoke, not the textbook phrases she'd learned in school, but the pure regional Sicilian that her nonna had whispered while braiding her hair. The language of mountain villages and ancient grudges, of families who settled disputes with blood and honoured debts that spanned generations. Marco was arguing with someone about a shipment, a delay, a problem that needed solving before tomorrow night. The kind of conversation that confirmed every dark rumour about his business dealings. The kind of conversation Sophia should not be able to understand. She forced herself to move, to carry the plates back to the kitchen, to pretend she hadn't just overheard information that could get her killed. But as she pushed through the swinging doors, she heard Marco's voice change. The irritation disappeared, replaced by something warmer, more vulnerable. "Papa," he said, switching to gentler tones. "Come stai? No, va bene. Domani sera prometto." Papa, father, promise. Sophia's hands finally shook as she set the plates by the dishwasher. Marco Sant'Angelo, the man who could have someone disappeared with a phone call, was promising his father something in the language of her grandmother's bedtime stories. In the dialect that connected them both to a small island in the Mediterranean, where honour mattered more than law and family was everything. When she returned to the dining room, table 12 was empty. Marco and his men had vanished like smoke, leaving only a stack of cash that was easily 3 times their bill and a business card that simply read M. Sant'Angelo with a phone number written in black ink. Sophia stared at the card, knowing she should throw it away, knowing that keeping it meant crossing a line she could never uncross, knowing that men like Marco Sant'Angelo didn't leave generous tips and personal phone numbers for invisible waitresses unless they wanted something. But she slipped the card into her apron pocket anyway, along with the memory of his voice speaking her grandmother's language and the electricity that had sparked when their fingers touched. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean for whatever tomorrow might bring. 6 weeks after Enzo's blood had stained Romano's marble floors, Sophia stood in what used to be Marco's study and surveyed her transformation with something that felt suspiciously like pride. The room had become a war room, its elegant mahogany surfaces now covered with maps of Seattle, photographs of rival family members, and genealogical charts that traced bloodlines back to villages in Sicily that most people couldn't find on a map. The woman arranging these documents bore little resemblance to the invisible waitress who'd served coffee with shaking hands. Sophia's dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her eyes. Her clothes were tailored perfection, a charcoal blazer over silk blouse that whispered of money and power. When she moved through the house now, Marco's men stepped aside with respectful nods instead of protective hovering. She was studying surveillance photos when Salvatore shuffled into the room, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had begun the process of betraying his mind. His eyes, when they focused on the war council Sophia had assembled, carried a mixture of pride and concern that reminded her achingly of her grandmother's expression during difficult conversations. "Mia cara," he said in careful English, settling into the leather chair he'd claimed as his own. "You look like a general preparing for battle." Sophia smiled, switching automatically to the Sicilian dialect that had become their private language. "Perhaps because I am, nonno." Salvatore's weathered hands traced patterns on the chair's armrest, a nervous habit that had developed as his condition progressed. "Your nonna. She would understand this, the necessity of war when peace becomes impossible." "Tell me about the old feuds," Sophia said, pulling up a chair beside him. "The ones that started before your family came to America." For the next hour, Salvatore's voice carried the music of remembered stories. He spoke of blood debts that stretched back generations, of insults that festered like infected wounds, of marriages that had been arranged to end conflicts, and businesses that had been built on the graves of enemies. His memory for distant events remained crystal clear, even as recent conversations faded like morning fog. Sophia took notes in a mixture of English and Sicilian, mapping connections that revealed the true scope of what her grandmother had been caught up in during the war. Lucia Torino hadn't just been a midwife. She'd been a keeper of secrets, a neutral party trusted by families who'd been murdering each other for centuries. "The Torino brothers," Sophia said carefully. "They claim our family owes them something from those days." Salvatore's expression darkened. "Tommaso and Vincent Torino are jackals who feast on old bones. Your grandmother owed them nothing. If anything, they should be lighting candles for her memory, instead of using her granddaughter as a weapon. But they believe otherwise. They believe what serves their purposes." Salvatore's voice carried the authority of someone who'd navigated these treacherous waters for 8 decades. In the old country there were rules, honour codes that even enemies respected. Here, these men pick and choose which traditions to follow based on profit and convenience. Sophia made another note, adding to her growing understanding of the cultural dynamics that made her such a valuable target. Her heritage gave her legitimacy in a world where bloodlines mattered more than bank accounts, but it also made her a symbol that could be manipulated by anyone clever enough to twist the narrative. Marco appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately shifting the room's energy. He'd been in meetings all morning with his lieutenants, planning responses to the increased aggression from rival families who saw Enzo's betrayal as an opportunity to test the Sant'Angelo organization's stability. "Any insights from our family historian?" he asked, moving to stand behind Sophia's chair with a possessiveness that had become natural to both of them. Several." Sophia turned to face him, acutely aware of how his attention focused on her with laser intensity. "The Torino brothers are using a bastardized version of old-world honour codes to justify their actions. They're claiming my grandmother broke some ancient obligation, which gives them the right to collect blood debt from her descendants." Marco's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "And what does the actual history say?" Sophia gestured to her notes, pages filled with Salvatore's memories and her own research into wartime Sicily. "That Lucia Torino was trusted by everyone precisely because she belonged to no one. She delivered babies and kept secrets and saved lives without asking which family the children would grow up to serve. Which makes their claim complete fabrication." Sophia's voice carried growing confidence as the pieces fell into place. "They're using my surname to legitimize a power grab, nothing more." Salvatore nodded approvingly. "La nipoti comprende." The granddaughter understands. Marco's hands settled on Sophia's shoulders, his touch warm through the silk of her blouse. "Then we have our ammunition for the next phase." Sophia leaned back against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. The physical contact that had once terrified her now felt like coming home, like finding the missing piece of herself she hadn't known was lost. "What did you learn from your meetings?" she asked. "That Vincent Calabresi is getting nervous about his alliance with the Torino brothers, that 3 of my father's old associates want to meet with you directly to verify your bloodline, and that someone very professional has been asking questions about our security arrangements." The last piece of information made Sophia's stomach clench. Professional meant expensive. Expensive meant serious intentions. Serious intentions meant the kind of violence that left bodies in the Sound and families planning funerals. "How long do we have?" "Days, not weeks." Marco's voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing dinner plans instead of assassination attempts. "Which is why I have a proposal for you." Sophia turned in her chair to face him fully, reading the calculation in his dark eyes. "What kind of proposal?" "The kind that ends this permanently." Marco moved around to perch on the edge of his desk, close enough that Sophia could see the gold flecks in his irises, could count the individual lines of strain around his eyes. "The kind that requires you to trust me completely." Salvatore leaned forward with sudden interest. "Che cosa hai in mente?" "What do you have in mind?" Marco's smile was beautiful and terrible. A feast, traditional Sicilian hospitality extended to all the families who've been questioning Sophia's legitimacy. An opportunity for them to meet the granddaughter of Lucia Torino face to face, to hear her speak their language, to verify that she is who she claims to be. Sophia felt her pulse spike as she recognized the trap inherent in his suggestion. And during this feast? During this feast we settle old debts, we clarify misunderstandings, we make sure that everyone leaves with a clear understanding of what happens to people who threaten my family. The words were euphemistic, but Sophia heard the steel underneath. Marco was proposing to eliminate the rival family's leadership in a single coordinated strike, using traditional hospitality as both bait and justification. That's... Sophia searched for words adequate to describe the audacious brutality of his plan. "That's either brilliant or completely insane." "In my world," Marco said softly, "there's usually no difference." Salvatore's eyes were bright with something that might have been nostalgia or bloodlust. "Your nonna would appreciate the poetry of it, using the old ways to punish those who've corrupted them." Sophia looked between the 2 men who'd become her family, saw the expectation in their faces, felt the weight of a decision that would determine whether she survived the next week or died as a symbol of someone else's ambition. "When?" she asked, and heard her grandmother's voice in the single word. Not if, but when. Not whether she was brave enough, but how soon she could prove it. Marco's smile was triumphant and tender in equal measure. "Tomorrow night?" As Sophia nodded her agreement, she caught her reflection in the window glass and saw someone her grandmother would have recognized. Someone who understood that sometimes the only way to honor the past was to write the future in blood. The Sant'Angelo estate had been transformed into something that belonged in a Sicilian palace, all crystal chandeliers and imported roses, hand-painted ceramics and silver that reflected candlelight like captured starlight. Sophia stood in the centre of it all, wearing a midnight blue gown that whispered of old-world elegance and new-world power. Her grandmother's pearl necklace at her throat, like a talisman against the violence she knew was coming. The dining room could seat 30, but tonight it hosted only 12. The most dangerous men on the West Coast, gathered under the pretence of honouring traditional hospitality while planning each other's destruction with smiles that never reached their eyes. Tommaso and Vincent Torino had arrived first, their expensive suits unable to disguise the predatory hunger in their movements. They'd greeted Sophia with elaborate courtesy, kissing her hand and speaking in carefully pronounced Sicilian that carried subtle insults wrapped in flowery compliments. Sophia had responded with equal formality, her accent perfect enough to make their eyes narrow with surprised respect. Vincent Calabresi came with his nephew, both men radiating the kind of casual violence that made waitstaff nervous and busboys disappear into the kitchen. When Sophia greeted them in the dialect of their grandmother's village near Palermo, Calabrese's weathered face had shown genuine surprise before calculating interest replaced it. The other family representatives filled out the table with a collection of aging patriarchs and ambitious lieutenants, each one studying Sophia with the intensity of men trying to determine whether she was an asset or a threat. The conversations flowed in a mixture of English, Italian and regional dialects that created layers of meaning within layers of deception. Marco sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, magnificent in a black dinner jacket that emphasized the dangerous grace of his movements. When he looked at Sophia, his eyes held heat that promised rewards for surviving the night and punishment for anyone who threatened her. Salvatore occupied the place of honour at Marco's right hand, his presence legitimizing the gathering according to traditions that stretch back centuries. "A toast," Marco said, as the antipasto course was cleared away, his voice carrying across conversations in 3 languages. "To Lucia Torino, whose memory brings us together tonight, and to her granddaughter Sophia, who honours that legacy with her presence at our table." The toast was drunk with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but Sophia caught the way. Tommaso Torino's smile turned predatory when he thought no one was watching. She'd been studying these men all evening, cataloguing tells and weaknesses with the systematic precision her grandmother had used to identify which babies would survive difficult births. "Tell us about your nonna, cara mia," Vincent Calabrese said, his voice carrying paternal warmth that didn't extend to his calculating eyes. We knew her reputation, of course, but family stories often carry details that history forgets. Sophia set down her wineglass with deliberate precision, aware that every word she spoke would be analysed for authenticity and weakness. When she began to talk, her voice carried the musical cadence of someone who'd learned Sicilian at her grandmother's knee. Mia Nonna used to say that bringing life into the world was the closest thing to touching God's work with human hands. She delivered over 300 babies during her years as a midwife, but the ones she remembered most clearly were the 17 born during the occupation. The table went quiet, conversations fading as dangerous men leaned forward to catch every word. Sophia felt the weight of their attention like pressure against her skin, but she'd learned to use that pressure instead of being crushed by it. She never spoke of it directly, but I understood that those births were different, dangerous, women labouring in cellars while soldiers searched house to house, babies born in silence because crying meant death for entire families. Salvatore's eyes were bright with moisture as Sophia continued, his memories filling in details that her grandmother had never shared. The other men listened with the intensity of people hearing their own family histories reflected in a stranger's words. The night Lucia delivered the Sant'Angelo baby, Marco's uncle, the bombing was so close that plaster fell from the ceiling into the birthing basin. But she stayed until the child drew breath, until the mother was safe, until the family could flee to relatives in the mountains. Sophia met each man's eyes as she spoke, using the eye contact to measure their reactions, to separate genuine emotion from calculated performance. She saw recognition in Calabrese's expression, doubt beginning to crack Tommaso Torino's certainty, something that might have been respect in the faces of the smaller family representatives. "That's a beautiful story," Vincent Torino said, his voice carrying poisonous sweetness. "But family legends can grow in the telling. How do we know these tales aren't simply what you've been told to say?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sophia felt the temperature in the room drop as conversations stopped and dangerous men turned their attention to what might become the evening's first open provocation. Sophia's smile was serene as mountain snow. "Because, Don Vincent, my grandmother didn't just deliver your cousin's child, she delivered yours as well." The silence that followed was absolute. Vincent Torino's face went white, then red, then settled into something that looked like fury wrapped in carefully controlled shock. Sophia watched him realise that she knew family secrets that weren't supposed to exist, that her grandmother's legacy included information that could destroy reputations built over decades. "Impossible," Tommaso whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Sophia reached into her small evening purse and withdrew a photograph that had been hidden in her grandmother's papers for 60 years. The image showed a young woman, unmistakably Lucia Torino, holding a newborn baby, while a man who looked exactly like Vincent Torino at 30 stood guard by a window. "Your mother was 17 and unmarried," Sophia said, her voice gentle but implacable. "The father was a German soldier who'd been kind to her during the occupation. My grandmother delivered your older brother in a barn outside Corleone and never told anyone whose bastard child she'd helped bring into the world." Vincent Torino stared at the photograph like it was a serpent preparing to strike. The revelation that he was half German, born of collaboration during the occupation, would destroy his standing in a community that valued pure bloodlines and resistance heritage above almost everything else. "You're saying that Lucia kept our secrets," Calabresi said slowly, understanding the implications immediately. "I'm saying that my grandmother kept everyone's secrets." Sophia's voice carried absolute certainty. She never broke confidence, never revealed information that could harm the children she'd helped bring into the world, even when those children grew up to become dangerous men who forgot their debts to the woman who'd saved their lives. She withdrew more photographs, spreading them across the table like cards in a deadly game. Images of her grandmother with various family patriarchs, holding babies who'd grown up to control territories from Vancouver to San Francisco. Evidence of debts that had never been acknowledged, loyalty that had never been reciprocated. "The question," Sophia continued, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "is what happens to families who've spent decades disrespecting the woman who died, keeping their secrets safe." Marco's smile was beautiful and terrible as he watched Sophia systematically dismantle the foundation of every challenge to her legitimacy. The men around the table were beginning to understand that they hadn't been invited to judge her heritage. They'd been invited to answer for their own. Salvatore spoke into the growing tension, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived 8 decades of these deadly games. "In the old country we had a saying, chi non ricorda il passato è condannato a ripeterlo. Those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But those who try to rewrite the past," Sophia added, her grandmother's steel finally showing through the silk diplomacy, "often discover that some debts can only be paid in blood." The feast continued, but the conversations had changed. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that Sophia could feel it in the air, could see it in the way dangerous men avoided her eyes and spoke in more respectful tones. She'd used their own traditions against them, their own honour codes to establish her unassailable position as Lucia Torino's legitimate heir. When the main course arrived, traditional ossobuco that filled the dining room with the sense of her childhood, Sophia caught Marco's eye and saw something in his expression that might have been awe. She'd just outmanoeuvred some of the most dangerous men in America, using nothing but family photographs and the truth her grandmother had died protecting. The trap was set. The prey had been identified. Now all that remained was to spring it with the precision of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required becoming the predator instead of the prey. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Sound like an army preparing for war. But inside the fortress walls of the Sant'Angelo estate, Sophia Torino was finally ready to claim her place as the queen her grandmother had raised her to become. 3 months later, Sophia Sant'Angelo stood in the same dining room where she destroyed her enemies with nothing but truth and her grandmother's photographs. But tonight the space had been transformed for celebration instead of war. White roses and baby's breath decorated every surface, their delicate perfume mixing with the scent of traditional Sicilian wedding cake that had taken Maria 3 days to perfect. The woman adjusting her grandmother's antique lace veil in the gilt mirror bore no resemblance to the invisible waitress who'd once served coffee with trembling hands. Sophia's reflection showed someone who commanded respect without demanding it, who could switch between languages and dialects like a diplomat, who wore power as naturally as the custom-made wedding gown that had been crafted by designers in Milan specifically for this day. The confrontation at the feast had ended exactly as Marco had planned, though Sophia's strategic brilliance had made the violence almost unnecessary. When Vincent Calabresi attempted to poison her wine during the dessert course, a desperate final gambit to eliminate the woman who'd exposed too many family secrets, his violation of hospitality rules had given Marco all the justification he needed. The old-world codes that Sophia had used to establish her legitimacy had also provided the framework for eliminating those who refused to respect them. The Torino brothers had fled Seattle the same night, their credibility destroyed by revelations about their bastard bloodlines and fabricated claims. Vincent Calabresi would never threaten anyone again, his death serving as a reminder that some traditions carried lethal consequences for those who broke them. The smaller families had sworn renewed loyalty to the Sant'Angelo organization, recognizing that Sophia's cultural legitimacy gave Marco's empire something money couldn't buy: authentic connection to the old world foundations that still mattered in their insular community. Mia cara regina. Salvatore's voice carried pride that made Sophia's chest tight with warmth. He stood in the doorway wearing his finest suit, the one reserved for weddings and funerals, his silver hair combed back and his eyes bright with joy. "You look like something from a Renaissance painting." "My dear Queen." The title still made Sophia's pulse quicken, not because of its implications of power, but because of the affection with which Salvatore spoke it. Over the past months, she'd watched him deteriorate physically while growing stronger in spirit, sustained by the knowledge that his son had found someone who understood what family truly meant. "Nonnu," Sophia said, crossing to take his arm, "are you ready to walk me to my husband?" Salvatore's smile was radiant, despite the tremor in his hands that spoke of advancing illness. "I have been ready for this day since the moment you spoke to me in my own language. Your nonna, she would be so proud to see what her granddaughter has become." They walked through hallways lined with photographs that told the story of 3 generations of Sant'Angelo power, but the newest addition made Sophia's breath catch every time she saw it. A formal portrait taken after the feast, showing her and Marco standing together with Salvatore between them, all 3 wearing expressions of quiet triumph. The invisible waitress had vanished completely, replaced by a woman who looked like she'd been born to rule. The ceremony was held in the estate's garden, where fairy lights twinkled among the evergreens, and the sound stretched beyond them like a silver carpet leading to infinity. 200 guests filled white chairs arranged in perfect rows, representing every major family on the West Coast, along with legitimate business associates who preferred not to ask too many questions about their host's methods. Marco waited at an altar decorated with white roses and trailing jasmine, magnificent in a midnight blue tuxedo that emphasized the predatory grace of his movements. When his eyes found Sophia walking toward him on Salvatore's arm, his smile carried heat that promised celebration would continue long after the guests departed. The priest spoke in a mixture of English and Latin, blessing a union that had been forged through shared violence and tempered by genuine devotion. When Sophia spoke her vows in fluent Sicilian, translating them into English for guests who didn't share her linguistic gifts, she saw tears in the eyes of old women who remembered when such traditions were commonplace instead of exotic. "I promise to stand beside you through prosperity and war," she said, her voice carrying across the garden with absolute certainty. "To protect what we build together with the same courage my grandmother showed when protecting others. To honour the past while building a future worthy of the sacrifices that brought us here." Marco's vows were spoken in English, but they carried undertones that every guest understood perfectly. Promises of protection and provision, of loyalty that extended beyond death, of power shared between equals instead of possessed by one and endured by another. The ring Marco placed on her finger was Sicilian gold set with diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. When Sophia slipped a matching band onto his finger, she felt the weight of tradition and transformation combining into something new and precious. The reception flowed seamlessly from ceremony to celebration, with traditional music filling the garden and courses of food that honoured both Sicilian heritage and American abundance. Sophia moved through crowds of dangerous men and their elegant wives like she'd been doing it her entire life, accepting congratulations in 4 different languages and navigating conversations that mixed business with pleasure with lethal undercurrents. Don Sophia, one of Calabrese's former lieutenants, said, approaching with a mixture of respect and calculation. My family would be honoured to discuss potential partnerships with your new foundation. The Lucia Torino Foundation had been Sophia's idea, a legitimate charity that provided assistance to immigrant families while serving as perfect cover for more questionable activities. It also satisfied her need to honour her grandmother's memory through something more constructive than revenge, though the revenge had certainly felt satisfying at the time. Call my office next week, Sophia said, her smile warm but carrying undertones that suggested disappointing her would be inadvisable. My assistant will arrange a meeting. My office, my assistant. The possessive pronouns still felt foreign sometimes, but Sophia had learned to wear authority, like the designer gown that had been tailored specifically for her measurements. She was no longer someone who served others' needs while ignoring her own. She was someone whose needs were served by an organisation that spanned 3 states and generated more revenue than most Fortune 500 companies. As the evening progressed, Sophia found herself standing with Marco on the terrace overlooking the garden, watching their guests dance to music that blended traditional folk songs with contemporary arrangements. The woman she'd been a year ago would never have imagined herself here, surrounded by luxury and deadly power, wearing a wedding ring that marked her as the queen of an empire built on violence and loyalty in equal measure. Any regrets? Marco asked, his arm around her waist and his voice warm against her ear. Sophia looked out over the Sound, where container ships moved like ghosts across water that reflected the full moon in scattered diamonds. Somewhere out there was the life she'd left behind, the invisible existence that had been slowly killing her through neglect and economic desperation. Here, in Marco's arms and surrounded by evidence of the power they wielded together, she felt more alive than she'd ever thought possible. "Only one," she said, turning to meet his eyes. Marco's expression shifted to concern. "What's that?" Sophia's smile was radiant with mischief and affection. "That my grandmother never got to meet the man who sees me the way she always said someone would." Marco's laugh was pure joy, and when he kissed her there on the terrace with their empire spread out below them and their future stretching ahead like an unwritten story, Sophia tasted freedom instead of fear, partnership instead of possession. The last song of the evening was one Salvatore had requested, a traditional Sicilian ballad about love that survived war and exile. As Sophia danced with her new husband, while their guests watched with varying degrees of admiration and envy, she caught sight of her reflection in the terrace windows. The woman looking back was someone her grandmother would have recognised immediately, someone strong enough to protect what mattered, wise enough to honour the past while embracing the future, brave enough to love a dangerous man without losing herself in the process. The invisible waitress was gone forever, replaced by a queen who'd earned her crown through intelligence and courage instead of inheriting it through blood alone. Sophia Sant'Angelo had found her place in a world that celebrated power and punished weakness, had discovered that sometimes the best way to honour gentle ancestors was to become fierce enough to protect their memory. As the evening wound down and guests began departing with promises to stay in touch and subtle reminders of mutual obligations, Sophia stood with Marco and Salvatore on the front steps of the estate, saying goodbye to the last of the wedding party. "What happens now?" she asked as the final car disappeared down the winding drive. Marco's smile was beautiful and dangerous and full of promise. "Now we build something that will last for generations. Now we show the world what happens when invisible people refuse to stay invisible." Sophia looked up at the stars scattered across the Seattle sky like diamonds on black velvet. then back at the fortress-like house that had become her home, and the family that had chosen to claim her as their own. "Long live the Queen," she whispered, and meant it. 3 nights later, Romano's transformed into something Sofia had never seen before. The usual dinner crowd of tech executives and anniversary couples had been replaced by men in $1,000 suits who spoke in whispers and checked their watches like they were timing explosions. The air thrummed with tension so thick Sofia could taste it on her tongue. She'd been assigned to the private dining room, a glass-walled sanctuary normally reserved for marriage proposals and business deals that required absolute discretion. Tonight, it housed a gathering that made her skin crawl with instinctive fear. Marco Sant'Angelo sat at the head of the long mahogany table like a king holding court. To his right sat an elderly man who commanded the room's attention despite his age. Salvatore Sant'Angelo was 83 years old, with silver hair combed back from a face that had weathered decades of Sicilian sun and Seattle rain. His bearing was proud, aristocratic, the kind of man who'd been born to rule and never forgotten it. The other guests were wolves in expensive clothing. Sofia recognised some faces from newspaper photos and police bulletins posted in the restaurant's back office. The Torino brothers from Portland, Vincent Calabresi and his nephew from San Francisco, men whose names appeared in obituaries and court documents with equal frequency. Sofia filled water glasses and tried to become invisible, but invisibility felt impossible with so much dangerous attention focused in one room. These weren't ordinary diners. These were predators evaluating each other's weaknesses, calculating the price of betrayal, measuring the distance to the exits. Salvatore spoke very little English, she realised as she served the antipasto course. When he did attempt conversation with the other guests, his words came out halting and frustrated, tangled between languages and lost in translation. The other men smiled politely and spoke slowly, as if volume could bridge the linguistic gap. Sofia watched the old man's growing agitation with something that felt suspiciously like sympathy. She recognised the expression from her grandmother's final years, when dementia had begun stealing words and leaving confusion in their wake. But this wasn't dementia. This was the isolation of a man trapped between two worlds, understanding everything but unable to communicate with anyone except his son. She was refilling his water glass when Salvatore looked directly at her for the first time. His eyes were the same dark intensity as Marco's, but tempered with something that might have been loneliness. "Excuse me," he said in heavily accented English, struggling with each syllable. "You bring more bread, please." Sofia nodded and moved toward the kitchen, but something in his voice stopped her. The careful pronunciation, the formal cadence, the way he held his shoulders like a man carrying invisible weight. Her grandmother had sounded exactly the same during her first years in America, before English became comfortable and home stopped being a place across the ocean. Without thinking, Sofia turned back to him and spoke the words that would change everything. "Buonasera, nonnu. Come sta?" "Good evening, grandfather. How are you?" The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was absolute. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every fork paused halfway to every mouth. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees as 8 of the most dangerous men on the West Coast turned to stare at the waitress who'd just addressed Salvatore Sant'Angelo in pure Sicilian dialect. Salvatore's face transformed. The frustration melted away, replaced by wonder and something that looked dangerously close to tears. When he responded, his voice carried the music of mountain villages and ancient traditions. "Ah, Dio mio, finalmente qualcuno che parla la lingua del cuore. Come ti chiami, piccola?" "Oh my God! Finally, someone who speaks the language of the heart. What is your name, little one?" Sofia felt every pair of eyes in the room boring into her, but she couldn't stop herself from responding. The words flowed out like water finding its course, natural and unstoppable. "Mi chiamo Sofia. La mia nonna era di Palermo, vicino alla sua famiglia, credo." "My name is Sophia. My grandmother was from Palermo, near your family, I believe. Salvatore's eyes widened, and he leaned forward with sudden intensity. Palermo! Che quartiere? Quale famiglia? Palermo? Which neighbourhood? Which family? Torino, Sophia said, and immediately regretted it. Lucia Torino. The reaction was instantaneous. Salvatore shot to his feet with surprising agility, his chair scraping against the marble floor. For a terrifying moment, Sophia thought she'd said something wrong, revealed some terrible secret that would get her killed. Then Salvatore crossed himself and began speaking so rapidly that even Sophia's fluent Sicilian struggled to keep up. Lucia Torino, la levatrice, la donna che ha salvato mio fratello durante la guerra, Madonna Santa, tu sei la nipote di Lucia. Lucia Torino, the midwife, the woman who saved my brother during the war. Holy Mother, you're Lucia's granddaughter. Sophia's knees nearly buckled. Her grandmother had been a midwife, that much was true. But Sophia had never known about any connection to the Sant'Angelo family, never heard stories about saving anyone during the war. Her nonna had been tight-lipped about the old country, sharing only language and recipes, never the darker stories that might explain why she'd left everything behind. Marco rose from his chair slowly, his movement predatory and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried a dangerous edge that made Sophia's survival instincts scream. You're Lucia Torino's granddaughter. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, a revelation, a judgment all rolled into one. Sophia nodded, not trusting her voice, acutely aware that admitting her heritage in this room might be the last mistake she ever made. The other men began murmuring among themselves, rapid conversations in Italian and broken English that she caught in fragments. Torino bloodline, old obligations, the midwife's debt, family honour. Salvatore continued his emotional monologue, gesturing between Sophia and his son while tears gathered in his ancient eyes. He spoke of debts that transcended generations, of loyalty that ran deeper than blood, of a young woman who'd risked everything to save Sant'Angelo children when fascist soldiers came hunting for resistance sympathisers. Sophia understood perhaps half of what he said, but the emotional undertone was unmistakable. Her grandmother hadn't just been a midwife. She'd been a protector, a guardian of secrets, a woman who'd earned the eternal gratitude of families like the Sant'Angelans through acts of courage that Sophia was only now beginning to comprehend. Marco's attention fixed on her with laser intensity, and Sophia felt like a butterfly pinned to a board. When he spoke again, his voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute authority. How long have you been in Seattle? 5 years, Sophia whispered. And you've been working at Romano's for how long? 8 months. 8 months? Marco's smile was beautiful and terrifying. 8 months you've been serving my dinners, listening to my conversations, and you never thought to mention that you're Lucia Torino's granddaughter. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sophia realised that her silence could be interpreted as deception, her invisibility as espionage. In this world, secrets were weapons, and hidden connections were potential betrayals. I didn't know, she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't know about any connection to your family. My grandmother never told me. Salvatore spoke sharply to his son in rapid Sicilian, his tone brooking no argument. Whatever he said made Marco's expression shift from suspicion to something more complex. Obligation, recognition, respect. My father says, Marco translated, his voice careful and controlled, that Lucia Torino's granddaughter is welcome at his table, that the debts of the past create bonds in the present, that you honour us with your presence. Sophia looked around the room at faces that ranged from curious to calculating to openly hostile. The Torino brothers were whispering urgently to each other, and she caught enough to understand that her surname meant something significant to them as well, something that might not be entirely positive. She backed toward the kitchen door, suddenly desperate to escape the suffocating weight of attention and expectation. I should let you enjoy your dinner. Wait. Marco's voice wasn't loud, but it stopped her like a physical barrier. "Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, my father would like to continue this conversation." It wasn't an invitation, it wasn't a request. It was a summons delivered with the kind of quiet authority that expected immediate compliance. Sophia nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and fled to the kitchen where Giuseppe and the other cooks pretended not to notice her shaking hands, or the way she leaned against the prep counter like her legs might give out. Through the serving window she watched the dinner continue, but everything had changed. Salvatore's mood had transformed from frustrated isolation to animated engagement, his hands moving as he told stories that made the other men listen with uncomfortable attention. And Marco never stopped watching the kitchen door, as if he could see through steel and brick to where Sophia stood trying to process the fact that her carefully constructed invisible life had just been blown apart by words in a language she'd learned at her grandmother's knee. Outside, the rain had stopped, but Sophia had the distinct feeling that the storm was just beginning. Sophia arrived at work the next morning to find her manager's office door closed and voices arguing in hushed tones behind the frosted glass. Through the thin walls she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach clench with dread. "Specifically requested her again. Don't know what kind of arrangement. Can't afford to upset customers like that." She busied herself with opening duties, setting up tables and refilling salt shakers, but her hands shook enough that she spilled granules across the white tablecloths. Everything felt different now, as if the air itself had changed composition. The other servers watched her with barely concealed curiosity, their whispers following her movement through the dining room like smoke. The morning shift passed in agonizing slow motion. Sophia served coffee and eggs Benedict to tech executives who barely looked at her, but she felt watched, hunted. Every time the door chimed, she expected to see expensive suits and predatory smiles. Every time her phone buzzed, she jumped like she'd been electrocuted. It wasn't until her lunch break that she learned what Marco's men had discovered about her past. The envelope appeared in her locker like a ghost materialized from thin air. Thick cream paper, her name written in elegant script across the front. Inside, a single photograph stopped her heart completely. Her grandmother, Lucia Torino, stood in front of a small stone house that Sophia didn't recognize. But it wasn't the setting that made her knees go weak. It was the people surrounding her nonna. 3 women holding babies, their faces radiant with relief and gratitude. 2 men in worn clothing who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. And in the background, barely visible in the shadowed doorway, a young man whose dark eyes and aristocratic bearing marked him unmistakably as a Sant'Angelo. The note attached was brief and devastating. "Your nonna was family to us. The debt runs deeper than you know. Come tonight. Don't disappoint." Sophia sank onto the narrow bench in front of her locker, staring at evidence of a life her grandmother had never shared. Lucia had talked about Sicily in fragments, always. Stories about lemon groves and Saint Day festivals, recipes for caponata and cannoli, prayers in a dialect that sounded like music. But never this. Never midnight rescues and hidden children. Never resistance networks and family debts that apparently transcended generations. She turned the photograph over and found more writing in the same elegant hand. Casa Torino, Palermo, 1943. Your grandmother delivered 17 babies during the occupation. 12 survived because of her courage. This debt cannot be repaid, only honoured. 17 babies, 12 survivors. Sophia's mind reeled as she tried to imagine her gentle grandmother, the woman who taught her to make pasta and recite rosary prayers, risking her life to bring children into a world at war. No wonder she'd left Sicily. No wonder she'd been so careful about the stories she shared. The afternoon shift crawled by with glacial slowness. Sophia served pasta to tourists and took orders from business lunches, but her attention kept drifting to the photograph hidden in her apron pocket. Every Italian phrase she overheard from the kitchen made her think of her grandmother's secret past. Every time she heard Giuseppe singing while he worked, She wondered what songs her nonna had hummed while delivering babies in houses that might be searched at any moment. By 6 o'clock, Sophia had worked herself into a state of barely controlled panic. She changed out of her uniform in the employee bathroom, hands trembling as she buttoned her only decent dress, a simple black thing she'd worn to her grandmother's funeral 3 years ago. It still smelled faintly of the lilies that had covered the casket. The address Marco had written on the back of his business card led to a building Sophia had passed dozens of times without really seeing. From the outside, it looked like any other downtown office complex, all glass and steel and architectural anonymity. But the security guard who met her in the lobby wore a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, and his smile never reached his eyes. "Miss Torino," he said, and the way he pronounced her surname made her understand that her name meant something here, something significant. "Mr. Santangelo is expecting you." The elevator ride to the 20th floor lasted forever, and no time at all. Sophia watched the floor numbers climb while her stomach dropped into her shoes. When the doors opened, she stepped into a world that existed on a completely different economic plane than anything she'd ever experienced. The office space was magnificent and terrifying. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Elliott Bay, where container ships moved like toys across water that reflected the sunset in streaks of gold and crimson. Italian leather furniture arranged around a marble coffee table that probably cost more than Sophia made in a year. Oil paintings on the walls that she suspected weren't reproductions. Marco stood with his back to the elevator, silhouetted against the dying light like something carved from shadow and expensive tailoring. When he turned, Sophia's breath caught in her throat. He'd changed from his business suit into dark jeans and a black cashmere sweater that emphasized the dangerous grace of his movements. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been relief. "Did I have a choice?" Marco's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "There's always a choice, Sophia. The question is whether you're brave enough to make the right one." He gestured toward the seating area, and Sophia perched on the edge of a leather chair that probably cost more than her grandmother's entire living room set. Marco poured himself a glass of something amber and expensive-looking, then raised an eyebrow in question. "I don't drink," Sophia said. "Smart girl." Marco settled into the chair across from her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something subtle and devastatingly masculine. "We need to talk. About my grandmother. About your grandmother. About the debt she created. About why you've been invisible for 5 years and what it means that you're not invisible anymore." Sophia's hands clenched in her lap. "I told you, I didn't know about any connection to your family." "I believe you." Marco leaned forward, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "But ignorance doesn't erase obligation. Your grandmother saved the life of my uncle during the war. My family owes her a debt that can never be fully repaid." "My grandmother is dead." "But you're not." The words hung in the air between them, like a blade balanced on its edge. Sophia felt the weight of expectation, of obligation, of something she didn't understand but couldn't escape. Marco reached for a manila folder on the coffee table and slid it across to her. "I had my people look into your situation." Sophia's hands shook as she opened the folder. The first page was a financial statement that made her want to vomit. Her grandmother's medical bills, still outstanding after 3 years. The second mortgage on the house that Sophia had been forced to sell anyway. Credit card debt from the months when she'd chosen between keeping the lights on and buying groceries. "You're drowning," Marco said, his voice gentle but implacable. 3 jobs, 60-hour weeks, and you're still barely keeping your head above water. When was the last time you bought something for yourself that wasn't absolutely necessary? Sophia's throat closed. She couldn't remember. Every penny went to bills, to debt, to the endless grinding machinery of economic survival that consumed everything and offered nothing in return. "My father is dying," Marco continued, and the sudden vulnerability in his voice made Sophia look up. Not quickly, not mercifully, Dementia is stealing him piece by piece, and the doctors say he has maybe 6 months before he won't recognise me anymore." Sophia thought of the proud old man from last night, the way his face had lit up when she'd spoken his language. "I'm sorry." "He responded to you in a way he hasn't responded to anyone in months. His nurses, his doctors, even me sometimes, we're all strangers to him now, but you spoke his language, and for 5 minutes he was himself again." The request came wrapped in silk, but Sophia heard the steel underneath. "What do you want from me?" "I want to hire you," Marco said. "Full-time, excellent salary, benefits, and all your grandmother's debts cleared immediately. In exchange—" "You spend time with my father, keep him calm, speak his language, help him remember who he used to be." Sophia stared at him. "You want me to be a companion to your father?" "I want you to be family." The word hit her like a physical blow. Family. The thing she'd lost when her grandmother died. The thing she'd been mourning without realising it. The belonging, the connection, the sense of being part of something larger than just economic survival. "And if I say no?" Marco's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something that reminded Sophia exactly who she was dealing with. "Then you say no, but you go back to your 3 jobs and your 60-hour weeks and your grandmother's debts. And when my father dies without ever having another conversation in his native language, we all live with the knowledge that things could have been different." It wasn't a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was the truth presented without mercy or negotiation. Sophia looked out the window at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there was her studio apartment with its leaking faucet and broken air conditioning. Her 3 jobs that paid barely enough to keep her afloat. Her invisible existence that had become a kind of living death. "How much?" she whispered. Marco named a figure that made Sophia's vision blur. It was more than she made in a year, more money than she'd ever imagined having at one time. "Plus the debts cleared," he added, "plus housing if you want it, plus the knowledge that you're honouring your grandmother's memory in a way she would understand." Sophia closed her eyes and saw her nonna's face, heard her voice singing Sicilian lullabies in the darkness. Lucia Torino had risked everything to save strangers' children. Maybe it was time for her granddaughter to risk something too. "When do I start?" she asked. Marco's smile was beautiful and terrible and full of promises she didn't understand yet. "Tomorrow." As Sophia signed the contract that would change her life forever, she caught her reflection in the window glass. For just a moment she looked like someone else, someone stronger, more determined, less invisible, someone who might survive in Marco Santangelo's world. Outside, the rain began to fall again, washing the streets clean for whatever came next. The next morning, Sophia stood outside the Santangelo estate with a single suitcase and the growing certainty that she'd just sold her soul to the most beautiful devil in Seattle. The property sprawled across 5 acres of waterfront that probably cost more than most people's houses, all manicured lawns and towering evergreens that provided privacy from the outside world and kept secrets locked safely within. Marco answered the door himself, dressed in dark jeans and a white button-down that made his olive skin look like it had been kissed by Mediterranean sun. When he smiled, Sophia's stomach did something that felt suspiciously like free fall. "Welcome home," he said, and the word home carried weight that made Sophia's chest tighten. The interior of the house was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Marble floors that reflected light from crystal chandeliers, oil paintings that belonged in museums, furniture that whispered of old-world craftsmanship and new-world wealth. But it was the photographs that caught Sophia's attention, dozens of them arranged on side tables and hung in silver frames along the hallway walls. 3 generations of Santangelo men stared back at her with those same dark, intense eyes. Wedding photos and christening portraits, family gatherings, and formal portraits that spoke of tradition and continuity. In several of the older photographs, she spotted faces she recognised from her grandmother's picture. the same proud bearing, the same Sicilian features that marked a bloodline stretching back centuries. "He's waiting for you," Marco said, gesturing toward a sun-drenched room at the back of the house. "He's been awake since 5 this morning, asking when La Nipoti would arrive." The granddaughter. Sophia's throat tightened as she realized that in Salvatore's mind she'd already been adopted into the family structure. She wasn't just an employee. She was a connection to his past, a bridge between the world he'd lost and the world he was forgetting. Salvatore Sant'Angelo sat in a leather chair beside floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Puget Sound. Morning sunlight turned his silver hair to spun platinum, and when he looked up at Sophia's approach, his face lit up with genuine joy. "Sofia!" he exclaimed in rapid Sicilian. "Finalmente ho pensato a te tutta la notte. Siediti, siediti, dimmi di tua nonna." "Finally, I thought about you all night. Sit, sit. Tell me about your grandmother." Sophia settled into the chair across from him, acutely aware of Marco watching from the doorway. When she spoke, the Sicilian flowed as naturally as breathing, muscle memory inherited from countless hours spent at her nonna's kitchen table. "Era una donna forte," Sofia began, and watched Salvatore's eyes grow bright with attention. "Una donna che aiutava tutti, non importa quanto fosse pericoloso." She was a strong woman, a woman who helped everyone, no matter how dangerous it was. For the next hour, Sophia found herself telling stories she'd never shared with anyone, about her grandmother's herb garden and the women who came seeking remedies for ailments that couldn't be discussed with male doctors, about the prayers Lucia whispered while kneading bread, invoking protection for families scattered across 2 continents, about the way she taught Sophia to read the sky for weather and people's faces for truth. Salvatore listened with the intensity of a man starving for connection, occasionally interrupting with questions or stories of his own. He told her about the night his younger brother had been born during an Allied bombing raid, how Lucia had delivered the baby by candlelight while explosions shook the walls, how she'd refused payment, saying that bringing life into the world was payment enough. Marco appeared periodically, bringing espresso in delicate porcelain cups and observing the interaction with something that looked suspiciously like amazement. Sophia caught him watching her hands as she gestured, the way Italian conversation required movement as much as words, the way her entire posture had changed, shoulders straight with confidence instead of curved with the protective invisibility she'd worn like armour. When Salvatore began to tire around noon, his words slowing and his attention drifting, Sophia helped him to his bedroom. The old man gripped her hand with surprising strength as she settled him beneath a quilt that had clearly been embroidered by skilled hands. "Grazie," he whispered. "Non mi sono sentito così a casa da anni." "Thank you. I haven't felt this much at home in years." Sophia returned to the main living area to find Marco standing at the windows, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. When he turned, his expression was unreadable but intense. "I have never seen him like that," he said quietly. "Not since my mother died. You gave him something I thought was lost forever." "What's that?" "Himself." Marco moved closer, close enough that Sophia could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Do you understand what you've done?" Sophia took a step back, suddenly aware that they were alone in a house that felt more like a fortress than a home. "I had a conversation with an elderly man who misses his homeland." "You became family." Marco's voice carried certainty that brooked no argument. In his mind, in his heart, you're not an employee anymore, you're blood. The weight of that statement settled over Sophia like a heavy cloak. Family meant protection, but it also meant obligation. It meant being drawn deeper into a world where loyalty was currency and betrayal was paid for in blood. "What does that mean for me?" she asked. Marco's smile was beautiful and predatory. "It means you're under my protection now. It means anyone who threatens you threatens him, and anyone who threatens him answers to me." The promise should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a chain settling around her wrists, beautiful and expensive and impossible to remove. And if I want to leave, then you leave. Marco's voice was soft but carried undertones that suggested leaving wouldn't be as simple as packing a suitcase. But you won't want to, not when you see what we can offer you, not when you understand what family really means. Sophia looked around the magnificent room, at the oil paintings and crystal glasses, at the life of luxury that was being offered like a gift with invisible strings attached. Through the windows she could see the Sound stretching toward the Olympic Mountains, vast and beautiful and full of hidden currents that could pull a person under before they realized they were drowning. I should check on him, she said, needing distance from Marco's magnetic presence before she made another decision she couldn't unmake. Sophia. Her name in his voice stopped her at the doorway. When she turned, he was holding an envelope that hadn't been there moments before. Your debts, all of them, cleared as of this morning. The envelope contained bank statements, paid-in-full notices, documents that represented the financial freedom she'd never thought she'd see. Numbers that had haunted her sleep for 3 years, reduced to 0 with the stroke of a pen. Why? She whispered. Because family takes care of family. Marco's eyes never left her face. Because your grandmother saved my family, and now I'm saving hers. Sophia clutched the papers that represented her liberation from years of crushing debt, and realized that freedom always came with a price. She'd traded one kind of chain for another, poverty for obligation, invisibility for protection that might become imprisonment. But when Salvatore called her name from his bedroom, voice bright with the happiness she'd given him, Sophia understood that some chains were forged from love instead of fear. Some debts were worth honouring, even when the payment required stepping into a world where the rules were written in blood and enforced with violence. She folded the bank statements carefully and slipped them into her pocket, next to the photograph of her grandmother. 2 women, separated by an ocean and a generation, connected by the choices they'd made to save other people's families. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Sound, promising rain before nightfall. But inside the fortress-like walls of the Sant'Angelo estate, Sophia Torino began the process of becoming someone new, someone visible, someone protected, someone whose name would be whispered with respect instead of overlooked entirely. Someone whose grandmother would have recognized, even if Sophia didn't recognize herself yet. 2 weeks into her new life, Sophia discovered that living in a fortress came with its own peculiar rhythms. She woke each morning in a guest suite larger than her old apartment, where Egyptian cotton sheets and marble bathroom fixtures reminded her daily that she'd crossed into a different world entirely. The woman staring back from the gilt-framed mirror looked the same, but felt like a stranger, someone playing dress-up in clothes that cost more than she used to make in a month. Salvatore had claimed her completely. Each morning he waited for her in the sunroom with espresso already prepared and stories queued up like gifts he'd been saving. He spoke of Sicily with the passion of a man describing a lost love, painting pictures of lemon groves and ancient churches, of feast days and family gatherings that stretched from sunset to sunrise. Sophia listened with the hunger of someone who'd inherited cultural DNA but never the full story, finally understanding why her grandmother had whispered prayers in a language that sounded like music. Mia nipote, Salvatore called her now, my granddaughter. The words carried weight in his mouth, claiming her with the certainty of blood, even though they shared no genetic connection. When he introduced her to visitors, his voice rang with pride that made Sophia's chest tight with unfamiliar warmth. But it was Marco who complicated everything. He moved through the house like a predator comfortable in his territory, appearing at unexpected moments with coffee or documents or questions that seemed casual until Sophia caught the calculation in his dark eyes. He watched her interactions with his father with the intensity of a man studying battlefield intelligence, cataloguing every smile, every laugh, every moment of genuine connection. "You're good at this," he said one afternoon, finding Sophia in the kitchen after Salvatore's nap. She was preparing arancini the way her grandmother had taught her, rice balls stuffed with meat and peas, and rolled in breadcrumbs that would fry to golden perfection. At what? Making him remember who he used to be. Marco leaned against the marble counter, close enough that Sophia could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that made her think of Mediterranean nights. The doctors said he'd be completely lost by now. Instead, he's more lucid than he's been in months. Sophia shaped another rice ball with hands that had learned steadiness through years of invisible service. He just needed someone to listen in his own language. It's more than that. Marco's voice carried certainty that made Sophia look up from her work. You see him, not the patient, not the old man losing his mind. You see the person he was, the stories he carries, the pride he built over 80 years of living. The observation hit closer to home than Sophia was comfortable with. She'd spent so many years being invisible herself, overlooked and dismissed, that recognizing that same erasure in others came as naturally as breathing. Your grandmother taught you that, Marco continued, and Sophia's hands stilled on the rice. How to see people that others ignore, how to make them feel human when the world treats them like ghosts. My grandmother taught me to survive. Same thing. Marco moved closer, and Sophia felt the heat radiating from his body like sunlight through expensive fabric. In my world, seeing people clearly is the difference between life and death, knowing who to trust, who to protect, who to eliminate before they become a problem. The casual mention of elimination made Sophia's stomach clench, reminding her exactly what kind of man she was living with. But when Marco reached past her to steal a piece of arancini from the cooling rack, his fingers brushed her wrist and sent electricity shooting up her arm. Marco! Her voice came out breathier than she'd intended. Sophia! He said her name like a prayer, and when she looked up, his dark eyes held heat that had nothing to do with the kitchen's warmth. For a moment, the space between them crackled with possibility. Sophia felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by magnetic force that overrode every rational thought about dangerous men and their dangerous worlds. Marco's hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. Then Salvatore's voice called from the sunroom, asking for more coffee, and the spell shattered. Sophia stepped back so quickly she nearly knocked over the flour canister, while Marco's expression shifted from tender to carefully neutral in the span of a heartbeat. I should... Sophia gestured vaguely toward the coffee pot. Of course. Marco's voice was steady, but she caught the slight roughness around the edges. We'll continue this conversation later. It wasn't a question. It was a promise that made Sophia's pulse race as she fled the kitchen with a fresh cup of espresso and cheeks burning with embarrassment. The afternoon passed in careful normalcy. Sophia helped Salvatore with his physical therapy exercises, listening to stories about his courtship of Marco's mother, while her mind kept returning to the moment in the kitchen. To the way Marco had looked at her like she was something precious instead of just useful. To the heat in his eyes that suggested his interest went far beyond her ability to speak Sicilian dialect. She was helping Salvatore into his evening clothes when he surprised her with a question that cut straight to the heart of her confusion. Ti piace mio figlio? Do you like my son? Sophia's hands stilled on his shirt buttons. Cosa intendi? What do you mean? Salvatore's laugh was knowing and affectionate. Ah, cara mia, I may be old, but I'm not blind. The way you look at each other, the way the air changes when you're in the same room. Your grandmother would have recognized the signs. Heat flooded Sophia's face. We're not... Marco needs someone strong, Salvatore continued, as if she hadn't spoken. Someone who sees past the power and the fear to the man underneath. Someone who understands that protecting family sometimes requires terrible choices. I don't understand his world. But you understand him. Salvatore's weathered hands covered hers, warm and surprisingly steady. And he understands you in a way that frightens him, Men like my son, they learn early that caring about someone gives enemies a weapon to use against them. The observation hit like a physical blow. Sophia thought about the photographs she'd seen, about Marco's mother who died when he was barely 18, about the careful way he held himself apart from everyone except his father. "He thinks I'm a weakness," she said. "No, Cara, he thinks you're his salvation, and that terrifies him more than any enemy ever could." Dinner that evening carried an undercurrent of tension that made Sophia hyper-aware of every glance, every casual touch, every moment when Marco's attention fixed on her with laser intensity. They ate in the formal dining room, crystal glasses and silver cutlery, reflecting candlelight that turned the meal into something intimate despite the enormous table. Marco had changed into a dark suit that emphasized the predatory grace of his movements, and when he smiled at something Salvatore said, Sophia felt her resolve weakening. He was beautiful in the way dangerous things were beautiful, all sharp edges wrapped in expensive packaging. "Sophia," Marco said as Maria, the housekeeper, cleared the dessert plates. "Would you join me in my office? There are some things we need to discuss." Salvatore's knowing smile followed them from the room, and Sophia felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. Marco's office was masculine luxury incarnate, all dark wood and leather-bound books, with windows that showed the city lights spread out like a constellation below. "Sit," Marco said, pouring himself a glass of scotch that probably cost more than Sophia's old monthly salary. "Please." Sophia chose a leather chair that swallowed her like an embrace, acutely aware of the way Marco's attention focused on her with predatory intensity. "My father is dying," he said without preamble, and the bluntness of it hit Sophia like a slap. The doctors said 6 months. That was 8 weeks ago." Marco's voice was steady, but Sophia caught the tension underneath. "He's fighting it because of you, because for the first time in 2 years he has something to live for besides my success." Sophia's throat tightened. "Marco, you've given him back his dignity, his sense of purpose, his connection to the world he came from." Marco moved to stand behind his desk, silhouetting himself against the city lights. "Do you understand what that means to me? It means I'm doing my job. It means you've become family, not just to him but to me." Marco's voice dropped to something that sounded dangerously close to confession. "And family means everything in my world. Family means I would burn down this entire city to keep you safe." The promise hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying. Sophia felt herself balanced on the edge of a precipice, knowing that her next words would determine whether she fell or flew. "What are you saying?" Marco's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm saying that you're mine now, Sophia Torino. Whether you realize it or not, whether you want it or not, you're under my protection, in my care, part of my family in every way that matters. And if I don't want to be yours, then you'll break an old man's heart and disappoint your grandmother's memory." Marco's voice was soft but implacable. "But you won't leave, because you need this as much as we need you." Sophia looked around the magnificent office, at the life of luxury and danger that was being offered like a gift wrapped in silk chains. Outside, the city sparkled with promise and threat in equal measure. She thought about her old life, the invisibility and exhaustion and grinding poverty that had worn her down to nothing. Then she thought about Salvatore's joy when she spoke his language, about the way Marco looked at her like she was something precious, about the possibility of belonging somewhere after years of drifting alone. "What happens now?" she whispered. Marco's smile was beautiful and terrible and full of promises she was only beginning to understand. "Now we see how deep this goes. Now we find out what you're really made of." As if summoned by his words, lightning flashed outside the windows, illuminating the sound in stark relief. The storm Sophia had been sensing for weeks was finally arriving, and she had the distinct feeling that when it passed, nothing would ever be the same again. 3 weeks later, Sophia discovered that being under Marco Santangelo's protection was both a blessing and a curse, wrapped in Italian leather and delivered with predatory grace. The blessing came in morning coffee served on bone china, in designer clothes that appeared in her closet without explanation, in the way dangerous men stepped aside when she walked through the house like she belonged there. The curse came in the form of eyes that watched her everywhere she went, invisible threads that connected her to a man whose attention felt like standing too close to fire. She was reading to Salvatore in the garden when Maria appeared with a message that made Sophia's blood freeze in her veins. Her former co-workers at Romano's had been asking questions. Strangers had been photographing the restaurant. Someone had broken into her old apartment and searched through belongings she'd left behind. "What kind of strangers?" Sophia asked, though she suspected she already knew. Maria's expression was carefully neutral, but Sophia caught the edge of fear underneath. "The kind that Mr. Marco handles personally." Sophia found Marco in his study, surrounded by monitors that showed security feeds from locations across the city. He looked up when she entered, and his smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Ah, Sophia, perfect timing. We need to discuss your growing popularity." "What's happening?" Marco gestured to one of the screens, which showed grainy footage of men in dark clothing watching Romano's from across the street. "The Torino brothers have taken an interest in your daily routine. Vincent Calabrese has been asking questions about your grandmother's wartime activities, and someone very professional searched your old apartment with surgical precision." Sophia's knees went weak. She sank into the leather chair across from Marco's desk, trying to process the fact that her careful invisibility had been shattered beyond repair. "Why now?" "Because you're no longer invisible." Marco's voice carried dark satisfaction, as if her newfound visibility proved some point he'd been making. "Because spending time in this house, being seen with my family, has marked you as significant. Because in our world, anything significant becomes a target." The weight of what she'd lost hit Sophia like a physical blow. Her anonymity, her safety, her ability to disappear into crowds and be forgotten, all traded for silk sheets and expensive protection that came with its own deadly price. "What do they want?" Marco's smile was beautiful and terrible. "Information about what you know, what you've seen, what your grandmother told you before she died. Your bloodline gives you credibility in the old world community, but it also makes you dangerous to families who've spent decades hiding their wartime secrets." Sophia thought about her grandmother's careful silence, the stories that had never been shared, the photographs that had stayed hidden until Marco's investigation brought them to light. How many families had reason to fear what Lucia Torino's granddaughter might remember? "And if I don't know anything?" "Then they'll torture you until they're satisfied that your ignorance is genuine." Marco's voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather instead of her potential murder. "Or they'll kill you to ensure that any future memories remain permanently buried." The casual mention of torture made Sophia's stomach lurch, but it was the way Marco spoke that terrified her most. Not with concern or apology, but with the cold calculation of a man stating facts about a world where human life was currency to be spent. "You're enjoying this," she realized. Marco's expression shifted, dangerous amusement replaced by something darker. "I'm enjoying the fact that you can no longer pretend this is temporary, that you can no longer imagine walking away from this life, from this house, from me." He stood and moved around the desk with predatory grace, close enough that Sophia could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Your safety now depends entirely on staying under my protection. Your survival requires that you remain valuable to my family. Your life, Sophia Torino, belongs to me in every way that matters." The words should have sounded like threats. Instead, they sounded like promises wrapped in silk and delivered with the kind of possessive heat that made Sophia's pulse race despite her better judgment. "What if I refuse?" Marco's laugh was soft and utterly without humour. Then you'll last approximately 6 hours on the streets of Seattle before someone puts a bullet in your head and dumps your body in the Sound." He was close enough now that Sophia could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the pulse beating in his throat, could count the individual lashes that framed his dangerous eyes. "But you won't refuse," he continued, voice dropping to something that sounded suspiciously like seduction. "Because you're smarter than that. Because you've seen what I'm capable of protecting. Because you need this as much as I need you." Sophia's breath caught as Marco's hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone with reverent gentleness that contrasted sharply with the steel in his voice. "Marco, you're mine, Sophia. You've been mine since the moment you spoke to my father in his own language. Since the moment you chose to stay instead of running. Since the moment you realized that invisible was just another word for dead." The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the gentle romance Sophia had imagined in her few relationships. This was claiming, possessing, the kind of kiss that left no doubt about ownership or desire. Marco tasted like expensive scotch and dangerous promises, and when Sophia responded despite every rational thought screaming at her to resist, his smile against her lips was triumphant. "There," he murmured, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes. "Now we understand each other." Sophia's hands were shaking as she pressed them against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under expensive fabric. "This is insane. This is survival." Marco's voice was soft but implacable. "In my world, the only safety comes from belonging completely. Half measures get people killed." A knock on the study door interrupted whatever Sophia might have said in response. Marco stepped back with fluid grace, his expression shifting to neutral professionalism so quickly that Sophia wondered if she'd imagined the heat in his eyes. "Come." One of Marco's men entered, his face grim with news that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. "Boss, we've got a problem. The Torino brothers just made contact with Vincent Calabresi. They're planning something for tonight." Marco's expression went cold as Arctic wind. "What kind of something?" "The kind that involves the lady and a message they want to send about respecting family boundaries." Sophia felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that her value as a protected family member had just made her a target for families who wanted to prove that the Santangelos could be reached, could be hurt, could be made to bleed. Increase security on the house," Marco ordered, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "Double the patrols. No one gets within a mile of this property without my knowledge." "And the lady?" Marco's eyes found Sophia's, and she saw something in their dark depths that was both promise and threat. "The lady doesn't leave this house until the Torino problem is solved permanently." As Marco's man left to implement the new security measures, Sophia realized that her transformation from invisible waitress to visible target was now complete. She was trapped in a fortress of luxury and violence, protected by a man who claimed to own her soul, hunted by enemies who wanted to use her blood to send messages about power and respect. Outside the study windows, storm clouds gathered over the Sound like an army preparing for war. And somewhere in the distance, Sophia could swear she heard the sound of rain beginning to fall, washing the world clean for whatever violence the night might bring. The last of her illusions about choice, about freedom, about the possibility of returning to her old life died quietly in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She belonged to Marco Santangelo now, completely and irrevocably. The only question was whether she would survive long enough to understand what that really meant. The trap was set with surgical precision, and Sophia walked into it with the trusting naivety of someone who still believed that family meant safety instead of leverage. It started with Enzo Santangelo's casual suggestion over breakfast. Marco's cousin had always been the charming one, the family diplomat who smoothed rough edges with easy smiles and carefully timed jokes. When he offered to escort Sophia to Romano's for what she told Salvatore would be her final shift, his proposal sounded like kindness wrapped in family concern. Marco's tied up with business until late, Enzo said, buttering his toast with the same careful precision he applied to everything. But you shouldn't have to disappoint the old man because my cousin can't manage his schedule. Sophia looked across the breakfast table at Salvatore, who'd been asking about her promise to say goodbye to her co-workers for 3 days running. The disappointment in his weathered face was harder to bear than her own reluctance to venture outside the fortress-like safety of the estate. "It's not safe," Sophia said, though even she could hear how the words lacked conviction. "It's 2 hours," Enzo countered smoothly. "Peak dinner rush, plenty of witnesses, full security detail. What could go wrong?" "Everything," Sophia's instincts screamed. But Salvatore's hopeful expression and Enzo's reasonable arguments wore down her resistance like water against stone. Marco had left before dawn for meetings that apparently couldn't wait, and Sophia had spent the morning pacing the house like a caged animal, jumping at shadows and feeling the walls closing in. Maybe Enzo was right. Maybe 2 hours under armed guard would prove to herself that she could still exist outside Marco's protective bubble. Maybe saying goodbye to her old life properly would help her accept the new one completely. By 4 o'clock, Sophia found herself walking through Romano's front door for the first time in a month, wearing a designer dress that cost more than her old monthly salary and flanked by 2 men whose suits couldn't quite conceal the shape of shoulder holsters. The restaurant felt like visiting a museum exhibit of her former life. The same marble floors and expensive lighting, the same kitchen sounds and customer chatter, but all of it viewed now through the lens of someone who'd crossed an invisible border into a different world entirely. Giuseppe spotted her first, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure before confusion clouded his expression. Sophia looked different now, carried herself differently, moved with the confidence of someone who'd learned that being seen wasn't always dangerous. "Sophia, Madonna mia, look at you. Like a princess, no?" The other staff gathered around with curious smiles and careful questions, treating her like she'd returned from an exotic vacation instead of a violent underworld they couldn't begin to imagine. Sophia answered their inquiries about her new job with carefully rehearsed half-truths, acutely aware of Enzo's presence at the bar and the way his attention never quite left her, despite his casual conversation with the bartender. It was while she was laughing at one of Giuseppe's stories that Sophia noticed the atmosphere in the dining room had changed. The usual dinner crowd was there, but scattered among the tourists and business diners were faces that made her blood run cold. Men in expensive suits who weren't eating, weren't talking, weren't doing anything except watching. Her security detail had noticed too. Sophia caught the subtle shift in their posture, the way their hands drifted toward concealed weapons, the silent communication that passed between them like predators scenting danger. Enzo appeared at her elbow with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ready to go? Traffic's getting heavy, and Marco will kill me if I'm late getting you home." Sophia nodded, suddenly desperate to be back behind the estate's secure walls. But as they moved toward the exit, Enzo's phone buzzed with a text message that made his face go pale. "Change of plans," he said, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or excitement. "Marco wants us to wait here until he arrives." The lie hit Sophia like a physical blow. Marco never changed plans without calling her directly. Marco never sent messages through intermediaries when her safety was involved. Marco would never, ever ask her to wait in a public place when threats had been made against her life. Sophia's training in reading people, inherited from a grandmother who'd survived a war by recognizing danger before it arrived, screamed warnings that her conscious mind was only beginning to process. Enzo was the betrayer. Enzo had volunteered to escort her specifically because he was delivering her to someone who wanted her dead or worse. Enzo's nervous energy and careful suggestions hadn't been family concern. They'd been the behaviour of a man preparing to commit an unforgivable sin. Sophia forced her expression to remain neutral while her mind raced through options. The restaurant had 2 exits, the front door, which was now blocked by men who weren't there for the risotto, and the kitchen's back entrance, which led to an alley that could easily become a trap. "Of course," she said to Enzo, proud that her voice came out steady. "Should we wait at the bar?" Enzo's relief was palpable and damning. "Perfect. I'll get us drinks." As he moved toward the bar, Sophia caught the eye of one of her security guards and mouthed a single word: bathroom. The ladies' room was a sanctuary of marble and gold fixtures that reminded Sophia of the luxury she was fighting to survive long enough to enjoy. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed Marco's number, praying to every saint her grandmother had ever invoked that he would answer. "Sophia?" Marco's voice carried immediate concern. "What's wrong?" "Enzo," she whispered. "He brought me here, but this isn't right. There are men watching, and he's lying about orders from you." The silence on the other end of the line was more terrifying than shouting would have been. When Marco spoke again, his voice carried the kind of cold fury that promised someone was going to die before the night was over. "Where are you exactly?" "Romano's. He said you wanted us to wait here, but—" "I'm 20 minutes out. Lock yourself in the bathroom and don't trust anyone except my voice on this phone until I get there." The line went dead, leaving Sophia alone with the sound of her own heartbeat and the growing certainty that she was about to discover exactly how violent Marco's world could become when family betrayed family. Through the bathroom door, she could hear normal restaurant sounds continuing as if the world weren't about to explode. Clinking glasses and casual conversation, the sizzle of food in the kitchen, the ordinary soundtrack of people who had no idea they were about to become witnesses to something that would make the evening news. Sophia's hands had stopped shaking. In their place, she felt the strange calm that had descended on her grandmother during air raids, the clarity that came from accepting that survival required action instead of hope. She checked her reflection in the mirror and saw someone she barely recognized. Not the invisible waitress who'd served these tables a month ago, and not the pampered companion who'd spent the morning reading to an elderly man in silk pajamas. This was someone new, someone who'd inherited more than just language from Lucia Torino, someone who might actually survive what came next. Outside the bathroom door, Sophia could hear Enzo's voice calling her name with increasing urgency. Time was running out, and the trap was closing with mechanical precision. But for the first time since entering Marco's world, Sophia Torino felt ready for war. The war began with the sound of shattering glass and Giuseppe's scream from the kitchen. Sophia heard it through the bathroom door. The distinctive crack of a wine bottle exploding against marble, followed by rapid Italian that wasn't the cheerful chatter of dinner service. This was panic. This was the sound of ordinary people realizing they'd walked into someone else's nightmare. She pressed her ear against the door and caught fragments of chaos erupting in the dining room. Chair legs scraping against marble, the clatter of dropped silverware, a woman's voice high and scared asking her companion what was happening. Then came the sound that made Sophia's blood freeze. Enzo's voice, no longer charming or diplomatic, cutting through the confusion with deadly authority. "Everyone stay calm. This is family business. Nobody needs to get hurt if you keep your heads down and your mouths shut." Through the crack under the bathroom door, Sophia could see feet moving with military precision. Heavy boots that belonged to men who knew how to use violence as a tool. Expensive Italian leather that marked Enzo's position near the hostess station. And scattered throughout the dining room, the panicked shuffle of customers who'd come for pasta and found themselves trapped in a war zone. Sophia's phone vibrated with a text from Marco. 2 minutes out, stay hidden." 2 minutes felt like forever when she could hear her security detail's voices raised in sharp challenge, could hear Enzo's responses getting more heated, could sense the moment when negotiations would give way to bullets. The explosion of gunfire, when it came, was nothing like the movies. In an enclosed space, weapons sounded like the world ending. Sophia's ears rang with the percussion of violence as she pressed herself against the bathroom wall, trying to become invisible through sheer force of will. Glass shattered. Someone screamed. Heavy objects hit the floor with the distinctive thud of bodies dropping. Sophia closed her eyes and saw her grandmother's face, heard Lucia's voice whispering prayers in Sicilian during air raids that had sounded remarkably like this. Her nonna had survived fascist occupation and Allied bombing by staying calm when the world exploded around her. Sophia drew on that inherited strength now, forcing her breathing to slow even as chaos erupted outside. The bathroom door handle rattled. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized someone was testing whether it was locked. "Sophia," Enzo's voice, soft and cajoling. "Come out, Cara. This will all be over soon." She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Every instinct inherited from a woman who'd hidden resistance fighters from Nazi patrols screamed at her to remain silent and still. "I know you're in there." Enzo's voice carried a note of frustrated urgency. "My associates are getting impatient. If you come out now, this can end without more bloodshed." More bloodshed. Sophia's stomach clenched as she realized that people were already dead, that her presence in this restaurant had turned it into a battlefield where innocent bystanders paid the price for her connection to Marco Sant'Angelo. The gunfire resumed with renewed intensity, and this time Sophia heard something that made her pulse spike with desperate hope. New voices shouting orders in the controlled cadence of Marco's men. He'd arrived with reinforcements, and now the restaurant had become a three-way war between Enzo's betrayal, rival family soldiers, and Marco's rescue operation. Through the chaos, Sophia heard Marco's voice, deadly calm despite the violence surrounding him. "Where is she, Enzo?" "Safe." Enzo's response carried poisonous satisfaction. "For now, but my friends have very specific ideas about how to send messages about respecting boundaries." "Your friends are about to discover what happens when you threaten my family." The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop 20 degrees. Sophia could hear it in the sudden silence that followed Marco's words, the moment when even trained killers recognized they were facing something more dangerous than themselves. Then the world exploded again. Sophia lost track of individual gunshots in the symphony of destruction that followed. Tables splintered under automatic weapon fire. The antique mirror behind the bar shattered into a million pieces. Someone was shouting orders in rapid Italian while someone else screamed for medical attention. The bathroom door shuddered under impact, not bullets, but the weight of a body being slammed against it. Sophia pressed herself into the corner and watched the door strain against its hinges. "Marco!" she shouted, not caring any more about staying hidden. "I'm in the bathroom." The response was immediate and terrifying. The door exploded inward as someone kicked it off its hinges, revealing Enzo silhouetted against the chaos behind him. His expensive suit was torn and blood-stained, his charming smile replaced by something feral and desperate. "There you are." He stepped into the bathroom, and Sophia could see the pistol in his right hand, could see the wild look in his eyes that suggested he'd crossed lines there was no coming back from. "Time to go, cousin." Sophia backed against the far wall, mind racing through options that all seemed to end with her death. Enzo was between her and the door. He had a gun and years of training in violence. She had silk pumps and the rapidly dying hope that Marco would reach her in time. "Why?" she asked, stalling for seconds that might make the difference between life and death. "Because the old ways are dying, and your boyfriend refuses to see it." Enzo's voice carried bitter resentment that must have been festering for years. "Because I'm tired of watching him build an empire on my grandfather's reputation while treating me like hired help. Because the Torino brothers offered me something Marco never would: respect." The irony hit Sophia like a physical blow. The Torino brothers, her own surname, weaponized against the family that had protected her. Her grandmother's legacy twisted into a knife aimed at the man who'd given Sophia everything she'd never dared to want. "The debt between our families means nothing to me." Enzo's grip on the pistol tightened. "But your blood on Marco's conscience, that means everything." He raised the weapon, and Sophia saw her death reflected in his eyes. But her grandmother's voice whispered one final lesson about survival. Sometimes the only way to live was to stop being afraid of dying. Sophia lunged forward just as Enzo pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered the mirror behind where her head had been a split second before. Sophia's shoulder caught Enzo in the midsection, driving him backward into the doorframe with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs. They went down together, fighting for control of the gun, while chaos continued to rage in the restaurant beyond. Enzo was stronger, but Sophia had inherited more than just language from her grandmother. She had the desperate cunning of someone whose ancestors had survived when survival seemed impossible. She drove her knee upward with every ounce of strength she possessed, connecting with Enzo's wrist hard enough to make him cry out and lose his grip on the pistol. The weapon skittered across marble tile, disappearing under the ruins of the bathroom door. "You little—" Enzo's curse was cut off by the distinctive sound of a gun being cocked behind him. Sophia looked up to see Marco silhouetted in the destroyed doorway, his weapon trained on his cousin's head with the steady precision of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. "Step away from her," Marco said, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that promised immediate consequences for disobedience. Enzo froze, still pinning Sophia to the floor, but no longer fighting for the gun. When he spoke, his voice carried the bitter knowledge of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. "You're too late. They know everything. Where you live, who you protect, how to hurt you where you'll feel it most." Marco's smile was beautiful and terrible. "They know nothing, because dead men tell no tales and traitors leave no witnesses." The gunshot that followed was precise and final. Enzo Santangelo died with his cousin's name on his lips and surprise in his eyes, learning too late that some betrayals carried a price that couldn't be negotiated. Sophia felt the weight of his body go limp against her, felt the warmth of blood that wasn't hers spreading across marble that had seen too much violence for one night. Marco was beside her in seconds, pulling his cousin's corpse away and gathering Sophia against his chest with hands that shook despite his controlled voice. "Are you hurt?" Sophia shook her head, not trusting her voice. She wasn't hurt physically, but something inside her had changed in that bathroom. Some innocence had died along with Enzo, replaced by the knowledge that she could fight for her life when survival required it. "It's over," Marco whispered against her hair, and Sophia heard sirens in the distance, heard the sound of his men securing the scene, heard the ordinary world preparing to intrude on the extraordinary violence that had just played out. But as Marco helped her to her feet and led her through the wreckage of Romano's dining room, Sophia knew that nothing was over. The war had just begun, and she was no longer an observer. She was a combatant. The safe house smelled like antiseptic and old leather, a combination that reminded Sophia of her grandmother's medicine cabinet and the kind of secrets that were kept in locked drawers. Marco had brought her here after the restaurant shooting to a nondescript building in Georgetown where the windows were bulletproof and the doors required 3 different keys to open. Sophia sat on the edge of a leather couch, staring at her hands while Marco paced the room like a caged wolf. Blood had dried under her fingernails, Enzo's blood, and no amount of scrubbing in the safe house bathroom had made them feel clean again. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face in the moment before Marco pulled the trigger. Surprise, betrayal, and something that might have been relief. "You should have told me," Marco said for the 4th time in an hour. His voice carried the controlled fury of a man trying very hard not to explode. "The moment something felt wrong, you should have called me." "I did call you. You waited until you were trapped in a bathroom with a traitor pointing a gun at your head." Marco stopped pacing and turned to face her, and Sophia saw something in his dark eyes that looked suspiciously like fear. "Do you understand how close I came to losing you tonight?" Sophia looked up at him, really looked, and saw past the expensive clothes and predatory grace to the man underneath. Marco's hands were shaking slightly, barely perceptible unless you knew what to look for. His usually perfect hair was dishevelled from running his fingers through it. The careful control he wore like armour had cracks in it that revealed raw vulnerability beneath. "But you didn't lose me." "By seconds, Sophia, literally seconds." Marco sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell gunpowder and expensive cologne. "If you hadn't fought him, if you hadn't bought yourself those few extra moments—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sophia heard the ending anyway. If she hadn't fought, she'd be dead. If Marco had arrived a minute later, he'd have found her body instead of her breath. The reality of how close she'd come to never seeing him again hit her like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't!" Marco's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't apologise for surviving. Don't apologise for being brave enough to fight when fighting was the only option left." Sophia's throat tightened with unshed tears she'd been holding back since the gunfire stopped. "I killed him. Enzo is dead because of me. Enzo is dead because he betrayed his family." Marco's voice carried absolute certainty, no room for argument or self-doubt. He made choices that led to that bathroom, that led to pointing a gun at someone under my protection. You defended yourself. I finished what he started. The distinction should have mattered, but Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed a line tonight that changed her fundamentally. The invisible waitress who'd served coffee and avoided confrontation was gone, replaced by someone who could drive a knee into a man's wrist hard enough to disarm him. "What happens now?" she asked. Marco's smile was beautiful and terrible. "Now we find out who else thinks they can use you to hurt me. Now we discover which of my business associates need to be reminded that Sophia Torino is off limits. Now we make sure tonight's message was received clearly." The casual mention of violence made Sophia's stomach clench, but she'd moved past the luxury of being shocked by Marco's methods. She'd seen what his world looked like when the facade dropped, had felt the weight of a dead man's body against hers, had heard her own voice screaming his name through gunfire. "The Torino brothers," she said, "will be handled." Marco's voice carried dark promise. "Along with anyone else who thinks your grandmother's legacy gives them the right to use her granddaughter as a weapon?" Sophia thought about the irony of it all. Her surname, which had protected her through childhood and connected her to Salvatore's memories, had become the thing that painted a target on her back. The debt her grandmother had created through courage and kindness had been twisted into justification for violence and revenge. "My father doesn't know," Marco continued, and Sophia heard something that might have been vulnerability in his voice. "About tonight, about Enzo's betrayal, about how close we came to losing you. The shock could kill him." Sophia nodded, understanding the weight of secrets they now shared. Salvatore's joy in her presence, his pride in introducing her as family, his fragile health that made him dependent on illusions of safety and stability. The truth about tonight would shatter more than just an old man's heart. "We'll tell him that Enzo was called away on business," she said, "and that you decided Romano's held too many memories to continue working there." Marco's eyes never left her face, which isn't entirely a lie. Sophia thought about the restaurant where she'd learned to be invisible, where Giuseppe had taught her kitchen Italian and tourists had left generous tips without ever seeing her face. All of that was gone now, destroyed by bullets and blood, and the knowledge that nowhere was truly safe when you belong to someone like Marco Sant'Angelo. What am I supposed to do with myself? The question came out smaller than she'd intended, revealing fears she'd been trying not to examine. Marco reached for her hands, his fingers warm and steady against her cold skin. "You're supposed to live, Sophia. You're supposed to wake up tomorrow knowing that you're safe, that you're protected, that you belong somewhere." "I belong to you. You belong with me." The correction was gentle but firm. "There's a difference." Sophia wanted to ask what that difference was, wanted to understand the distinction between possession and partnership in a world where power was the only currency that mattered. But when Marco leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, when she could count the gold flecks in his dark eyes and feel his breath against her lips, The question seemed less important than the warmth spreading through her chest. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, and the confession carried weight that made Sophia's heart race. "You didn't." "But I could have, and that terrifies me more than any enemy, more than any threat to my business or my territory." Marco's hands came up to cup her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones with reverent gentleness. "Do you understand what that means?" Sophia understood that she'd become his weakness, the soft spot in his armour that enemies would target to bring him down. She understood that caring about her put him in danger as much as it put her under protection. She understood that love in his world was as deadly as it was precious. "It means we're both in trouble," she said. Marco's laugh was soft and utterly without humour. "Cara mia, we've been in trouble since the moment you spoke to my father in his own language. Everything else has just been consequences." He kissed her then, gentle at first and then with growing intensity, as if he could convince himself through touch that she was really there, really alive, really safe in his arms. Sophia kissed him back with the desperate hunger of someone who'd stared death in the face and chosen to fight instead of surrender. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard and hearts racing, Sophia saw her reflection in the safe house windows. The woman staring back looked like someone she was still learning to recognize, someone stronger, more determined, less afraid of being seen, someone who might actually survive in Marco Santangelo's world. Outside, Seattle continued its ordinary existence, unaware that a war had been fought in an Italian restaurant and that the terms of engagement had just shifted permanently. Tomorrow there would be newspaper articles and police investigations, insurance claims and carefully worded statements about tragic violence between business rivals. But tonight there was only this: Sophia and Marco in a bulletproof room, holding each other like lifelines against a storm that was far from over. And for the first time since entering his world, Sophia wasn't afraid of what came next.